Welcome everyone to today's webcast. As you can see, the topic today is about strengthening your IT services, focusing a lot on utilizing a security-centric implementation of your RMM. That's really what we want to talk about today. As was mentioned, my name is Nick Cavalancia. I am a former MSP owner. I had one in a former life of mine. It was a number of years back when we probably called ourselves VARs more than MSPs. Didn't have all the cool tools that you guys have available today, but did the exact same thing. It was all about small and medium-sized businesses, outsourced IT, trying to standardize environments, create predictable, profitable business models. All that kind of stuff was very much the same. So this is something that's very much kind of near and dear to my heart. I am a Microsoft Cloud Data Center MVP. I got over 25 years of IT experience. So for those of you in the audience that go that far back with me, my very first server was a NetWare 2.2 server running in non-dedicated mode on a 286. Now, some of you are scratching your head going, what does any of that mean? And there's a couple of you that are actually like smiling and nodding your head. And for those folks that are nodding their head, yeah, go that far back. For those of you that have no idea what I'm talking about, I still go that far back. So the focus for today, as I'm talking about this topic with you, is to figure out how you can take a security-first approach to your business. Now, ultimately, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to strengthen your IT offering, again, leveraging and utilizing your RMM solution that you already have in place. But the idea here, first and foremost, is you've got to take a security-first approach. Now, in a lot of ways, some of you might think, well, I'll just go ahead and start offering some security services. And I mean, I've got patch management kind of already under my belt because that's part of RMM, and I can just go ahead and add on a couple more things, and bam, I'm suddenly offering security. But it's not really what I'm talking about. Instead, this is really more so thinking about the needs of your customers from a security standpoint, and thinking about how do I actually start to change the way that I deliver services so that things are kind of revolving somewhat around security. And the goal here isn't necessarily to make you an MSSP, a managed security service provider at all, but it's supposed to be around the idea that cybersecurity is moving more and more to the forefront. It's certainly becoming more of a customer concern. They're aware of it. They're hearing about it in the news. They're seeing ramifications from ransomware attacks and data breaches and RDP ports that are left open on the web. And I mean, all kinds of stuff that they're sort of aware about now, and trying to go, well, we take a security first approach to the way that we do everything we do. That's where I'm trying to get you guys in the audience to get to. Now, certainly, like I mentioned, for example, patching. The RMM solution that you have today provides some degree of security value. It might be patching, might be configuration, it might be able to do assessments, it might be able to do a little bit of vulnerability management, whatever the case is, you have some of that feature set here. But the idea here is to try and leverage every feature within your RMM that you can that involves security directly, as well as can be utilized indirectly to benefit security. And this way, what you end up finding at the end result of all this is, you haven't just started with where I kind of started on this slide, where you're like, I'll just start adding a couple of services that are security related. Instead, it's more about how do I kind of unify my entire approach, utilizing all of the solutions, all of the services that I have already in place, and help them augment the trying to get my customers secure. So there's a couple of reasons why you should take a security first approach. The first one that I've got here is that the cyber threats that we have today are getting worse and worse for the SMB. There's a little stat I'm going to throw up here. This comes from Ponymon's State of Cybersecurity in Small and Medium-Sized Business report. It's a 2019 report. They have not come out with a 2020, so this is the latest data, and I believe it came out late last year as well. So it's not too old of a set of data here. But you can see on the right here, right around 2/3, a little less than 2/3, depending on what you're looking at. This is the number of SMB customers that experienced either on the left, a cyber attack, or on the right, an actual data breach of some kind. So this is really high in comparison to, I've seen other reports that are still saying things like anywhere from 70 down to somewhere in the high 30s of percentages of SMB organizations that have said they've actually experienced attacks or data breaches and that sort of thing. So this data isn't out of line. It's a really good representation of what's going on in the industry. And on top of that is a couple things here. We're finding that the bad guys are becoming more and more targeted in their approaches. They are starting to look at very specific kinds of businesses, just like you guys do. There is one of you in the audience today that, let's say, just does law firms, and that's all you do, right? Or whatever industry vertical you want to kind of apply there, you go, that's me. I just do this kind of a business as my customers because I'm good at it. I know the applications, I know what their needs are, I know what kind of security they need, backups, retention, I got all that stuff, right? So just in the same way, the bad guys are looking at ways to target those same customers because they get really good at some of, for example, some of the messaging that might need to be used to socially engineer some of the employees of your customers, or what kinds of applications they can go after and then target and pull data out of in order to eventually maybe commit, let's say, fraud. As an example, there was a story about a year ago of a company that helped do real estate closings. And they were the target of a remote access Trojan attack. The person was able to laterally move through the network eventually, gained access to the application that keeps track of all the closings that were going to happen, and then found one that was of particular interest. Let's say that I'm closing on a house this Friday coming up, and I'm going to have to come up with $325,000.42. I'm going to give a really specific number on purpose here that I have to provide at the closing. And the closing's scheduled for 10 a.m. So Friday, 10 a.m., $350,000.42, right? So, and they know my name, and they know the name of the closing agent and the name of the realtor, because that's all inside of this application. And what they would do is the bad guys will then take that information and they'll go after that Mr. Cavalancia who's going to write that check. Now, dear Mr. Cavalancia, this is Ingrid from whatever closing company it is. I know you normally deal with so-and-so. Why? How'd they get that so-and-so's name from the application? And you've got your closing this Friday at 10 a.m. We're going to change the banking information where you're going to send your check for $350,000.42 because we had to make a modification on our end. So if you would start using this routing number and this bank account number, we'd appreciate that and have the funds there by 9:30. Now, as the victim, I'm checking all the boxes for credibility, right? They got my name right, they have the closing date right, the time right, the amount right, they know who my closing agent is. I mean, why would I have any red flags going up? So I'm going to I'm going to change my banking information and have it routed over to the other account, and now I've lost $350,000.42, right? So they're getting very targeted because they're realizing that just like you're good in certain niches with certain customers, so are the bad guys. They're really good at targeting specific kinds of customers. They are getting more sophisticated in their attacks. In a lot of cases now, we're even starting to hear stories about, for example, Active Directory being attacked. And I'm starting to hear that in the news, which I'm glad, because normally we're just kind of left with it was a phishing attack and nothing more. We're hearing about some of the things that are being done underneath the covers in order to gain access. Like one of the attacks I heard was that they had actually they're trying to spread malware, a ransomware attack. And so they laterally moved to the organization, hacked into Active Directory, modified one of the group policies in order to have a script run when the person logged on, and it would then try to install the ransomware. So that way even remote users would get it as well. So they're getting real sophisticated in their methodologies here. And then, of course, more severe. It's no longer like 5 servers and 10 workstations and, for example, a ransomware attack. It is scorched earth. They are trying to make sure they are guaranteeing themselves an ability to get the money by, first off, finding ways to attack and infect every machine possible. In the case of, I'll just stick with ransomware because it's a good topic here, things like extorting. They say we've already stole some data, we're going to post it to the web and just to prove that we've actually broken into your environment if you don't pay us the ransom, things like that. So there's a lot of badness that happens in these attacks. So that's the first reason. The second reason here is the fact that the SMB themselves, they're actually in a position, not every single one of them, but they're ready to do something about this. So a couple more stats are from the Ponymon report, but they were asked if they had in-house security expertise. And you can see the majority of them, almost 60%, either don't or aren't sure. And if they're not sure, they don't have it, right? I mean, the unsure I'm thinking of is the answer of something like, this is SMBs, mind you. These are, can be a medium-sized business, could be 100 people. But if you're going, do you have in-house security expertise? It might be, well, I know Bob knows something about that. But, the answer is no. Either you know you have security expertise or you don't, in my estimation. The other stat here is this is the percentage of security services that would be handled by a managed security service provider. And so basically it asked SMBs, what percentage of your security stuff is handled by a service provider? Now, you can see this is about a third in 2019 over on the very far right, 32%. That actually jibes with the UK insurer Hiscox. They put out a cyber readiness report every year. And it's a really good report to read right away because it does cover kind of broadly, not just the UK, but it covers the world. And in their estimation, it was 31% of SMBs are actually willing to outsource their information or their security services to service providers. So this is kind of an interesting stat because this one is saying we've already done it, and the Hiscox data is saying we're ready to, and obviously those are two different groups of people. So there's a real opportunity here for you because the SMB is ready to do something about it, and also that Hiscox data along the lines of the left-hand chart here, where according to the Ponymon report, only 58% say they're not sure if they even have in-house security expertise. The Hiscox data, they asked, how would you rate your ability to respond and deal with security threats? And I think it was 74%, if I remember correctly, said that we are security novices. We have no idea what we're doing. So good opportunity for you. They realize they don't know what they're talking about, and they realize they need to spend money and do it with a provider that knows what they're doing. And the best news, I think, here, the third reason is that your RMM solution already acts as the basis for this kind of service offering. So you think about this, you already have a reach into just about every endpoint, every server, everything that's on one of your customers' networks. So from that perspective, you have the reach, you have the scope, you have the breadth of being able to control, manage, reconfigure, assess, analyze, just about everything because you have your RMM solution in place. It already, as I mentioned earlier, it has some features already that are related to security. So things like patch management. You have hardware and software inventorying. That's also can be kind of utilized for security purposes. There's probably some integration points as well, that sort of thing. And then the other thing is that it's the natural extension. So you've already built this sort of service around remote monitoring and management. And security is a natural extension to the point where you're already doing some of these things related to security. You may modify, let's say, local policies around password lockout or something like that, or you might modify group policies in order to make sure they impact all the Windows endpoints, and you're making sure they're a little more secure and locked down. Those kind of things can happen. You're already doing some of this, so it kind of makes sense that if you have an RMM solution that's already doing some of this as well, and you realize that it's got like some automation features, some integration points with other solutions, things like that, you already have the basis, and it's just I'm making it sound super easy, and it's not. I know there's more work than this, but the idea is you're not just starting off from scratch going, well, what are we supposed to do? What do we do next? You already have something. You have a tool set on which to grow this service offering. So the question becomes, how do I start? What am I supposed to do? So I'm going to cover 3 basic steps here. That'll kind of cover the next few slides. The first one here, you're going to define what your security service looks like. What is going to be involved? What offerings are you going to have? What services do you want to provide within there? What's the scope, the SLA, all those things? I'm not going to cover all that detail, but I want to give you at least some direction in terms of how do you define what your security service looks like. The second part is, as you can see here, finding the solutions that are going to meet your need. RMM alone is not going to do it. You're going to need some other kinds of solutions here. And then the third part is where we kind of come back to this idea of leveraging your RMM to be security centric. Is there are ways to utilize the automation that RMM uses and does today that you can get some of those jobs done? I'm going to show you some very specific practical and tactical examples that we can do. So let's jump into the first one here, the first step, which is defining your managed security service. The thing here, as I mentioned early on, is you're not trying to be a managed security services provider. That's a very different set of security services. That's vulnerability assessment, data loss prevention, intrusion detection, SIEM management. I mean, all kinds. That's not it at all. Instead, what I want you to do is I want you to focus on just 5 sort of layers of security. I'm going to put up here on the screen, and the 5 layers here are, as you can see here, I'm kind of breaking this out from sort of the farthest away to the closest related to data. You have the perimeter, your logical perimeter. That is any of your customers that have someone that works on, let's say, a laptop at Starbucks, which, of course, in this day and age with this issue of the pandemic and things going on, people are moving more remote offices. That's probably less and less an issue. But wherever the person is, if they're at their home, on a shared network, on a private network, whatever happen to be there, that is now the perimeter for your customers. You got to be thinking about that. I also sort of think of the logical perimeter of things like email and the web, because if your customers can leave the security of whatever you've established for their environment and get out to the web, it's potentially can pull something back in, and or if someone's able to reach in and send an email with malicious content all the way into one of your customers' networks, again, that sort of becomes like the perimeter, because now we're allowing things to pass back and forth. So you got the perimeter, you have the network itself. So you might be doing things where you're watching for the security, for any kind of malicious traffic on the network. That would be something like intrusion detection, maybe. But you're trying to protect, who's on the network. So maybe just looking at something like things like, can they get on the Wi-Fi? What devices are on? Those kinds of things. The endpoints itself, so your workstations, laptops, whatever they happen to be, Windows, Mac, Linux, Unix, that sort of thing. I have the user in there because I see the user as a layer of security, typically when it revolves around training. And then, of course, the data. Now, this is not comprehensive. I've got one that's a little more comprehensive than this, and typically between like user and data, I have things like authentication, I have privilege, I have access, meaning actual use of the privileges, the access when they're trying to access things, and then the actual data itself. They can get a lot more detailed, but this is a good place to start. And typically, what we have, you see the top 3 layers here, that's typically where most MSPs play. They try to sort of play in the, well, we'll secure the perimeter, we'll put firewalls, or we'll put in a gateway of some kind, or VPNs, or whatever they're doing there. We'll protect the network, and then we'll also protect the endpoint. But I would really encourage you to be thinking about this in all 5 layers. And by the way, I think I haven't mentioned, I know it was mentioned at the intro here, but make sure if you have questions along the way, stick those in the Q&A box. We're going to do the questions at the end of the webcast today. So make sure you do that as well. So as you're thinking about defining your managed security service, again, you think about these 5 layers. Now, you have the ability with those 5 layers to be leveraging the automation that's built into your RMM solution that's already there. I've got some examples here that I pulled where I've got on the left-hand side of this little grid, I've got the security layer that corresponds with the previous slide here. And you can look through these yourself. As a matter of fact, I would tell you to take a screenshot of these because I'm not going to read each one to you. But you can see things, for example, just with like, let's say the perimeter, you have firewall settings you could put in place. You could establish how they're going to be protected when they're on a Wi-Fi network. If I jump down to things like the endpoint, I'm looking at the second bullet on the endpoint. You can assess and address known OS and application vulnerabilities, basically with patching, things like that. Down at the user, I could apply specific settings for applications that are going to make them more secure. So there's lots of things you can already do with RMM today that don't even involve buying another solution. What RMM basically lets you do is it gives you visibility into every endpoint, into things like, are they configured properly? Well, in essence, you may not be doing reporting per se, but in terms of visibility, the RMM solution itself can go verify that, well, that particular configuration setting that you want is in place. You have that visibility even if you're not the one looking at it. The RMM solution has it. You have this ability to protect, configure the environment as well. Again, some of these things on the right-hand side, and again, I welcome you to take a screenshot real quick. And then in a lot of ways also, there's an ability for remediation. This involves maybe some scripting, installing a patch, changing a configuration, whatever the remediation is that would be appropriate. There is an ability to do some of that remediation with the automation as well. So kind of keep that in mind, that you have kind of both I can see what's going on, I have the ability to proactively try to protect the environment, but I also have the ability to remediate any issues that may come up. So as you think about what you want to do here and you're defining your managed security service, you think about these 5 layers and you think about what you're comfortable with doing, what makes the most sense, what do you have expertise in, what solutions can you leverage, which we'll talk about next. And then that will help you kind of define, at least at a very high level, what your scope is going to look like for your particular service offering. That brings us to our second step here, which is now that you go, I think what I want to do is I want to definitely help the perimeter, the network, and the user, and the endpoint. I want to start with those 3. Those make a lot of sense. Now, what do I use? That's where step 2 comes in. You got to find the solutions that meet your needs. Now, you've got to look beyond RMM because in essence, RMM doesn't do it all. You think about, again, those 5 layers that we've got, and it helps with some of it. I showed you some examples of where it does, but it's not really protecting the perimeter. It's not really designed to protect the network. It's not designed to protect the endpoint, right? It's designed to help manage those things and can help, but that's not its definition. So instead, what I want you to do is I want you to think about this in terms of what other kinds of solutions you might put in place. So I've got this sort of graph here, and again, when this is done, I'm done with this slide. I'll leave it up for a moment or two. Definitely take a screenshot of this as well, if that makes sense, or perhaps the slides will be available after the presentation. I'm not sure which, but either or is fine. You'll see for things like the perimeter, there's a number of different kinds of solutions you can put into place. I'm going to start with things things like DNS and URL filtering. That'll help bad guys from being able to go back, let's say, to a command and control server and get further instructions and download a payload. It would also keep users from going outbound to some bad malicious URL. You have next-gen or cloud-gen firewalls. I mentioned intrusion detection and prevention. You have your web application firewalls as well, and use of DMARC would be used for making sure that email, as it goes out, it's coming from legitimate domains and being sent to legitimate domains. So there's some things you can do kind of in the logical perimeter, and you can see with some of these, if you look at the kinds of solutions, we're thinking about the logical perimeter from the sort of where is the user, how are people going out and coming in, that idea of the web traffic going for outbound, like users can get out of the network to go to the web, and email coming in, they can basically get past your firewall, as it were, and get right to the user's desktop. So when I think about it that perspective, from a network standpoint, there's a couple things that you can be doing. You could be doing like segmentation of the network. That'd be something that will help. There's just an attack on a electricity consortium in the EU, and it just happened like this past week. And they actually separate out their information technology and their operational technology, and their segmented networks. And so the attack got access to the IT network, if you will, but had no ability to access anything with the operational technology. So had no ability to do anything with like electrical grids or whatever the case would be. So network segmentation can actually come into play and be kind of handy here. Vulnerability scanning is where you're proactively looking across the network at your devices, your endpoints, your servers, your systems, anything that's connected to the network, and seeing if there are known vulnerabilities for that particular device. And then you'd go through the work of patching it with vulnerability management. And then tied with that, things like network monitoring and packet inspection to look for malicious packets, malicious kind of data going across the network. So I have that as well. Endpoint, pretty simple, anti-malware, antivirus, if you will, and then endpoint detection and response. The difference there being EDR is more of watching behavior on the endpoint to see if, for example, if a piece of malware uses an evasive technique like boring out memory, doesn't direct memory injection, it may actually bore out the memory being used by a known good process, like the example used that's ridiculous, but I use it anyways. Let's say you have Notepad running on a Windows machine, and it may bore out the memory that's being used by Notepad and inject in malware. And so if all you do is watch what process it is and you go, oh, it's Notepad, it's benign. But EDR solutions tend to look and go, well, what's Notepad doing? Why is Notepad calling run 32DLL? Why is it launching a child process of PowerShell? It shouldn't be doing any of those things. And then it becomes suspicious. And then that's where it kicks in and goes, let me kill that process or isolate it or whatever the case is. So those kinds of solutions there. For the user, email and web scanning, and then of course security awareness training so that they understand how they can actually help become part of the security strategy of the organization and be a little more security minded when it comes to interacting with the web and email. And then the last one here from a data perspective is cloud-based backup recovery, specific when I think about things like ransomware, because ransomware attacks are now going after and finding 42 different backup types that exist based on file type and file name. They're going after NAS devices where they figure that the backups are being stored, and they'll try to encrypt those. They'll try to leverage APIs from known backup vendors rather, and try to access their stuff using stolen credentials. So there's lots going on. You want to have cloud-based backup and recovery as much as possible. Now, having gone through all of these different things, you might go, holy moly, Nick, this is a lot of stuff. Am I supposed to implement all of this? No. Absolutely not. You're not supposed to implement all of it. The idea is I'm trying to give you solutions that are beyond RMM, that are going to provide value for a security service that you're going to offer, but you aren't required to do all of them. So kind of keep that in mind. So again, take a screenshot. I'm done with this slide for the moment, but take a look and see which ones might be applicable to you, and do a little research, and you figure out which ones integrate with the solutions you already have, which ones are you comfortable with, which ones have really good MSP-centric programs. All that kind of stuff kind of comes into play for you, because at the end of the day, you're trying to make a predictable and profitable business, and these things have to be MSP-friendly in order to accomplish that. So that leads me to my third and final step here, which is look for ways to leverage automation. So we've started off with this idea of you want to be security first, security centric. Then you want to try to take advantage of your RMM as much as you can. They're going to need to use some other solutions as well. And the last part here is really about just the idea of utilizing automation, whether it's automation in your third-party solution, but I'd also like to really be thinking about the fact that you can utilize the RMM's automation to do a lot of things as well. Because at the end of the day, for every service that you have, you're trying to create, I've mentioned this word at least 2 or 3 times already, you're trying to create a predictable business, right? You think about it, predictability breeds profitability. When you have your let's say you've got a service offering that revolves around keeping endpoints updated, and you've already done the math. Hopefully this should be math for most of you. You've already done the math that the average tech needs to spend 1 hour a month on a given endpoint, or maybe it's less than that. And so therefore you look at that plus your back office costs, plus any kind of cost of training, et cetera, and then you kind of average that out across your tech and all your other customers, and you end up coming back to, this is my actual cost per desktop per tech. And then you tack on a bit of profitability, and boom, you're there. Now, the only way you can get to what your pricing is going to be, which is that cost plus profitability, the cost has to be predictable. You got to know that it costs me about $47 a month to manage a desktop. I'm making this up as I go along, right? And I want to be able to charge, and make at least X% of profitability. So you end up dividing the numbers, and you say, I'm going to charge $85 per desktop per month, or whatever the number is. Again, the number doesn't matter. I'm just throwing numbers out for the sake of conversation. You have to make this predictable. But the challenge here is that when it comes to cybersecurity, there's not a lot of predictability, because you don't know how many attacks are going to occur today. Is this even the software that you put in place, regardless of what vendor puts it in place or who creates it, whether or not they're going to stop a zero-day attack, that kind of thing. If, let's say, it was something like ransomware, you don't know if it's going to be one machine, the entire environment. You have no idea what the scope of the encryption is going to be. There's a lot of unpredictability. And so you want to leverage automation as much as you can in order to create some additional degrees of predictability. And so there's a couple of benefits by doing this with RMM specifically. The first one here is just the idea of, if I can get by, there we go, it's consistency. The way that you're going to implement this is going to be done in an extremely consistent manner. Automation always makes sure that everybody gets the exact same configuration. The patching is the same patch, goes out to every desktop. The configuration is the same at every desktop. The scanning of every machine is the same. And then, of course, there's you leverage some reporting after the fact to figure out, well, here are the exceptions to what was supposed to happen, and you can kick off another job as is needed. So consistency is the first one. I always want to use, I can't find a CY word like consistency and accuracy to say up to date. I want to say currency because it's current, but that's not the right word. But I mean, couldn't say concurrency because that's not it either. I'm thinking currency would actually be accurate maybe, but in any event, I try to mean RMM keeps everything up to date, because again, if it's consistent, you're leveraging a tool that's going to ensure everyone is up to date, has the same thing, and there's an accuracy to it as well. So it's going to attempt to try and make sure that everybody has the same configuration, but at the same time, there's not this fat fingering of, well, I touched every machine and I configured every machine the exact same way manually. Well, who knows? What if I fat fingered machines 3, 5, and 7? Right? I consistently did the job, I did the task, but I may not have been accurate in the way that I executed it. And so there's an ability to make sure that with automation, there's some accuracy where it is done across every machine the same way every time. There's an aspect of response here as well. In some cases, the response to a given issue could be something like, let's say we have a ransomware attack. Okay, we're going to shut down all the workstations. Right? That's something you can automate. You can automate a shutdown request from your RMM solution, I'm assuming. Again, seems reasonable enough. I just don't know which one you have, but I'm assuming so. And so that could be a response. That's something where you could use automation and RMM's reach to every endpoint in order to accomplish that. So can keep that in mind. Scalability. You as an individual can only scale so much. You know that already. That's one of the reasons you use RMM today. Otherwise, if we go rewind the clock back before RMM, you were doing things manually. You were updating each machine. You'd spend the time. You'd install Office or whatever you were doing, right? And that doesn't scale because you can't make money that way. You got to do this in an automated fashion so you can scale your time and make this more value-based pricing than necessarily time-based pricing. And this is doing the same thing on a security standpoint. You've got to leverage automation from a scalability standpoint only because the number of attacks, the number of types of attacks, the number of attack vectors, the number of different social engineering scams, the complexity of phishing attacks and how malware gets infected on a machine. There's no way that you as an individual or any one of your techs can stay up and up to date on every single one of those types of things. You can't scale your knowledge. You need to leverage automated tools that are going to help you with that scalability to make sure that you can, back to my example of, let's say, turning off every machine. You can't turn them off fast enough, but you could send out something to, all 100 of your customers at once, or 100 desktops at a given customer at once, and you have that scalability. So as you're thinking about the fact that this is really critical, security is a big issue, and if something does happen, you have to be able to respond at scale to impact the entire customer's environment, or multiple customers, as the case might be. And so this will allow you to do it. And I should kind of tie back with response, thinking about this from a cross-customer perspective. You may find that, for the sake of argument, you have actually one customer that gets infected by some particular piece of malware, and there is a fix for it. You could go ahead and roll out that fix, proactively, or at least have it lying in wait for all your other customers. That's both sort of ties into response and scalability. And then this is what helps us get to this idea of predictability. And because now, again, it's not going to get totally predictable, because it isn't that predictable of a business, because it's security. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. But in the same ways, I sort of feel like if I can get automation in place to do most of the work, most of the figuring out where my issues are going to be, what needs to be done, keeping systems up to date, things like that, then what I end up doing is I end up having a customer environment that feels very similar to, you have a standardized environment, just like you do from, let's say, in your RMM business. Everyone has the same applications, they have the same patches, they have the same versions, and so on. So you shouldn't have that many issues, and you're only dealing now with the one-offs. You put out a couple fires, dealing with certain issues and so on, but everything else is running smoothly. That's what I'm trying to get you to from a security standpoint. And leveraging the automation built into your RMM solution helps create some of that predictability. And then because of that predictability, you end up yielding some profitability as well. So you've got, just think about this, in that fashion, where once you get to predictable, then you get to profitable. So to kind of sum this up a little bit, because I think I'm nearing the end of my time here. There are these 3 steps that you're trying to accomplish here, and you think about it. You've got to define what your service looks like. And I don't have this on a slide. I'm just kind of talking to you, kind of recap what I mentioned earlier. But you got to define what your service looks like, what the managed security means to you, what you're comfortable with, what you can do. You got to find solutions going beyond RMM that are going to meet your needs. But think about the fact that if you're going to come back to this slide that I've got here in front of you, if you agree and you like the idea of, yeah, I think I want to use my RMM as kind of a central focal point because it's automation, you're looking for solutions that are going to help integrate with your RMM. You're looking for solutions that can be leveraged by your RMM. In some cases, it might be a script or something like that, where something else can be called. Those are all viable ways, right? You've done this before. You guys have been in IT for a while, so I'm assuming you can think about this in a very creative way of how to either launch something or call something through an API or whatever the case is. But you want to come back to ultimately and look for ways to leverage our automation to get the job done. So I hope that the presentation today is informative and educational, and I think what we'll do next is, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take those now, and we'll go from there. So thank you very much for your attention, and we'll get to questions then.